I'm Jason with Born Handy, and I want to welcome you back to the Born Handy channel, where we take on pretty much anything a handyman might be asked to take on, plus a little extra. Today's video is on the a little extra side, and we are doing the 2-year update to the ultimate 75-gallon aquarium. This tank has come a long way since our original days of construction, which ironically was 3 years before water actually went into the aquarium. And so by some measure, this tank is actually 5 years old. But that's the thing about reef tanks, is that they're really almost never finished. So long as you are willing to put in the time and effort that it takes to keep your aquarium healthy, your aquarium is forever changing and never really finishes. So today I wanted to talk about some things that I had learned along the way and just share those with you. So if we go back and we compare this picture here from where the tank was very early in its setup, or even earlier when all the corals and the fish that I had purchased started out in a 10-gallon aquarium, and we look at what we look like today, the reality is it hasn't all been sunshine and rainbows. And in fact, I'm in the middle of the early stages of a recovery right now from a recent downturn in aquarium health. But I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. I want to get into the first thing that was a series of failures, was I've lost some fish. One of my favorite fish that I actually put in this tank, and he was one of the early additions, he was actually featured in another video about the aquarium, is my purple tang. So he didn't become aggressive or bullying or didn't outgrow the tank like a lot of people say. What he began to do is eat one of my corals. He just insisted that this brain coral down here was food for him, and he just wouldn't give up. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He had every intention of eating that coral. There was nothing I could do to stop him. I tried overfeeding. I tried moving the coral around. Nothing seemed to help. I said from the very beginning, this aquarium is going to be for the corals first, the fish second. And so as much as I love the purple tang, he had to go. I had another yellow tang that I actually purchased with the purple and this yellow tang that's here now. After months of being fairly healthy, fairly robust, a good eater, he began to lose weight and just become thinner and thinner and thinner, and he just wasted away. Another fish that I've lost, I had a goldhead sleeper goby that used to keep my sand looking really, really pristine at all times. And same thing, he lasted for a really, really, really long time. And then one day, and as a matter of fact, probably not more than a month after the yellow tang died, he began to also lose weight and become thinner and thinner and thinner. And no amount of food that he would eat seemed to help. Outside of that, I really haven't lost that many other fish. I think there's a couple of firefish gobies that didn't last for me, and possibly another fish or two that I'm not thinking about right now. But overall, the mortality rate of the fish in the aquarium has been very low. I lost some corals along the way as well. So some of those coral deaths were directly related to the fish deaths. What was happening is as the fish began to become thinner and thinner, I began to overfeed to try to overcome whatever issue was going on. And I began to have serious algae outbreaks. Some of the algae would just grow over the coral seemingly, overnight. And then the coral tissue would be dead in that area, and sometimes the coral would recover, sometimes it wouldn't. I began to do extremely frequent water changes to try to combat the overfeeding. And what I found was that corals that were seemingly unaffected by the rapid algae growth seemed to be affected by the increase in frequency of water changes. So when those fish went, I just decided I would never attempt that approach again. And I would just stick with fish that would forgive me more if maybe I'm not feeding them enough to their liking. So what you see in here right now is mostly a lot of beginner fish, and I'm completely happy with that. I mentioned a moment ago that the aquarium is in the early stages of recovering from a recent downturn in overall aquarium health. That's been related to my work schedule. I've neglected water changes that should have been done. I have at times allowed my refugium to overgrow, and then you began to have plants dying underneath. Instead of taking up nutrients, they were dumping them back into the water. There were times when I have not been good about keeping my kalkwasser going, or even my auto top-off reservoir filled. And particularly this summer, where it's been impossible to hire help for whatever reason, I find myself having to carry a little bit heavier load than is usual, and my aquarium has suffered because of that. But we are in the early stages of recovery, and things do appear to be turning around. I've had some equipment failures. When any part of the equipment goes down, it is an emergency, even if the failure rates are fairly low. The most frequent equipment failure that I've had has been the power supply for the Neptune COR 20. So my main pump, possibly one of the most important components of the aquarium, is having a power supply failure with some regularity. I became pretty frustrated with this, and I found on the forums, it was something that people said, yeah, I've had it as well. Getting a power supply on short notice at times was difficult, and particularly the last time was difficult. And at that point I had decided, you know what, if I burn the pump up, it's just too bad. I don't want the pump anyway. We're going to go with something else. I happen to have a 24-volt power supply that is used in an industrial PLC cabinet. It's capable of producing many more amps than the pump would need, and so I went ahead and used it. I was of the belief that the COR was pulling more amps than the power supply could deliver, and the power supply was burning itself up. I will say, since I have switched over to this new power supply, it's been pretty trouble-free. What I would notice is that the flow rate would drop, even with the pump being fairly clean, and then just a few days later, the power supply would go. Since I've put this on, I've seen no fluctuations in flow rate. I've had to make almost no adjustments to the valve in the back for my bean animal overflow system. So in my opinion, and it is just my opinion, I feel like there is a problem with the power supplies that are given to you with your COR 20 pump. I'll put more information about what power supply that I have in the description. But don't take my advice for it. Only try this if you're willing to scrap your pump. I don't want to be responsible if you let the smoke out of your COR 20 pump. Tunze Osmolator pump. I've had 2 failures with my Tunze Osmolator. Tunze, whatever. I don't care how you say it. Tunze. I found that surprising. So this was pushed as one of the best on the market. Yes, the aquarium's 2 years old. Yes, I understand equipment's going to fail. But I would feel like 2 years with a pump that's only used very, very infrequently, that has an emergency shut-off if it feels like the pump's running dry, that ultimately has never been used to pump anything except for reverse osmosis water, I just would think that thing would last longer. And so I've got where I just keep a few running spares. As a matter of fact, I have a spare right now just in case it goes out. There's another failure that probably gets under my skin a little, and that is the failure of my Apex Classic. Now the Apex has never stopped working, but what it does is it loses connection to the internet, and then I can't check it on my phone. I won't get a text message if there's an issue. That is a problem that I find to be just extremely frustrating. My Apex Classic is not wireless. There is no wireless link anywhere on it. It is directly connected to my router in my home, and it just loses the ability to make contact with, the Apex homepage that I use to check and see what's going on with the aquarium. I'll have to go through, there's a series of steps that you can take, resetting your router, reset the controller, blah, 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 and I can get it back on sometimes. Sometimes I have to run through those steps multiple times to get it to work. Sometimes once I get reconnected, it'll stay connected for weeks and weeks and weeks, and other times it'll stay connected for a day. At this point, unless I'm going on vacation or going to be gone for any length of time, I just leave it alone. It just stays disconnected. I think one of the reasons that frustrates me is I can't think of any other piece of equipment that I have that does that. I have some cameras that we use for my job. I can go into my phone and check those cameras anytime I want to. I have never one time had a situation where I couldn't access those cameras. I turn on my television, and every account that I have, whether it be streaming service A or streaming service B, there's never been a single time when they've said, oh, well, hold on, we can't validate your television for some reason. It just works. And so that, to me, that's just a major issue that they need to get worked out. That may be a problem that's been fixed with the newer Apex models. I don't know. But it is frustrating enough that I will tell you that when this controller goes out, I will probably shop at some of the other brands and see if there's something that is a little bit more reliable, possibly even going the do-it-yourself method with a Raspberry Pi or something of that nature. Other failures. So this is outside of the norm that you may not even consider this a failure, but I do. One of the things that I become frustrated with in this hobby is going to my local fish store. I live in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm sorry if I'm stepping on some toes here, but my local fish store has the world's worst hours for a pet store. I've often joked and said that the guy's open for unemployed people. He's closed 2 or 3 days a week. He doesn't open until after lunch, and then he's closed before 5 on a lot of days. The weekends are not much better. So if somebody has a heavy workload like I do, when I get in there on the weekends and I see a lot of people who have maybe better work hours that are more conducive to when the store's open, most of his corals are pretty heavily picked through. There's not a lot left for me there. So although I'm a big believer in supporting my local fish store, every single week when I go in there, he has more of the same stuff that he had the weeks previous, and a lot of the stuff that I have in here. But at some point, you want some variety, and when he just seems to be ordering only the things that he likes, Good news is that we have the ability to turn to the internet and do WYSIWYG corals. What you see is what you get. That has not always been the case. There have been multiple times when I've ordered corals that were WYSIWYG, and looking at the photograph, I expected some spectacular blue, and when I open the box, I have something that looks about as brown as a paper bag. Paying extra money for WYSIWYG, buying from a company that's worldwide known, and you get a coral that doesn't look anything like the photograph. Now you can tell the shape and the skeletal structure, it is the same coral, but that color that's represented on my computer screen is not even close to the color when I open the bag. And I've had people say, well, that's because they lose color during shipping. Corals may bleach during shipping, but the overall color of a coral is not lost during shipping. I've worked in the pet industry for a period of time in my life, and even with some of the wholesalers down in Tampa, Florida. And they're bringing in corals from all over the world that are, in some cases, a week in shipping and in transit. And these corals look pretty much the color they were when they shipped them when we open these containers, with very, very few exceptions. So I just have a hard time believing that a coral that was blue when you put it in the bag at your facility is brown 8 hours later when it arrives at my home and I open up and put it in my aquarium. So I'm going to come down off my soapbox and we're going to talk about some of the successes that I've had in this aquarium. One of the early things that I ran into early on, particularly in the forums, is that I was being told I will not be successful unless I have power heads in my display tank. Well, that's just not something I wanted to do. This is just an opinion that I have, but I feel like power heads are fairly unsightly. I feel like they're dangerous to some of the livestock, particularly anemones, and it's just not something that I wanted to do. It's extra equipment to maintain, extra equipment to fail, and I believed that I could overcome the need for a power head by going with a larger pump, to an oversized pump for an aquarium this size, frankly, a larger sump to accommodate the additional water flow, and larger lock line to keep the additional water flow from becoming a pressure washer, but instead a strong current. And I feel like that's been a huge success. I have a couple of zones in my aquarium that I might describe as fairly dead zones, but even in those places, I've seen other people's display tanks who have far worse water flow than I do, and even more dead zones, even with the use of power heads. So I'm going to call that a huge success, and I think that the growth in my tank speaks for itself in terms of whether or not that's been something that has worked. Part of the reason that we bring these aquariums and these animals into our home is we want a little piece of nature inside here, at least for me, that I can sit down and look at. And I have actually watched the clownfish lay eggs. I have actually watched the male fertilize the eggs. I've never seen them hatch, but I've seen their little eyes develop in the eggs and so on and so on. And it's always a thrill when I see that. And my kids, they get a big kick out of it as well. My Banggai cardinals, the babies that they've produced, I consider that a major success. The fact that these fish feel comfortable enough in the environment that I have provided for them to lay eggs, I think speaks volumes about the success of the aquarium, and it thrills me to no end. I still have most of the snails that I purchased when all of this was in a 10-gallon aquarium, and I think that's a pretty big success. I remember back early on in the days when I was doing this, when I first started, the best advice that you could get was bad advice. Snails were just one of those things that didn't last very long, and people used to say, well, you know, it's because they just come from an environment where they need wintertime. And I think there's probably some truth to that, but I also think that a big part of it was just husbandry. Back in those days, nobody ever talked about adding calcium back to your water as it was depleted, keeping your alkalinity up, and I think that has to do, those are the two biggest reasons that I think that I've had success with snails. You may be thinking, well, that's a silly thing to be proud of, but they're animals in my tank, and I feel like they've had long-term success. They've gotten quite large, and I'm pretty happy to see that they're still with me. I think the biggest success in terms of a cleanup crew has been sea urchins. I don't feel like sea urchins get the credit they deserve. My personal opinion, there is no better algae eater on the planet than a sea urchin, at least not one that you can bring and put in your aquarium. Maybe a manatee might eat more algae, but he won't fit. So I did have a problem with the long spine urchin early on. He got really, really, really big. He was probably as big as a basketball in this aquarium, and it had reached the point where he was knocking corals over everywhere he went. I couldn't clean the tank without getting 1,000 sticks, so I had to pull him out of here, and I ended up getting a tuxedo urchin. He was probably the size of a dime when I brought him home. He's about the size of maybe a 50-cent piece, maybe an inch and 3/4 across, and I'm happy. He eats just a ton of algae. You can tell that he's in the aquarium, and he's a great thing to see every now and then as he comes out with all the little bits that he puts on his back, including little bits of corals that I sometimes break off in cleaning the aquarium. He's an interesting little character, and he is a far better algae eater than any snail or any fish that I've ever put into any aquarium ever. The damsels. Now I know it's weird to say, what do you mean success with damsels are some of the easiest fish in the world? 4 yellowtail blue damsels in this tank. They are not killing one another. They are not killing other tank mates. For the most part, everyone in here gets along very, very well. The only real exception to that is when the clownfish lays eggs, they do tend to be a little bit more aggressive toward any of the other fish in the area. Outside of that, these fish get along really well, and I attribute that to the old adage that add your most aggressive fish last. And so the damsels being fairly aggressive, I added them last, and their tails were beat up and their fins were torn up when I brought them home, but today they look like perfect pictures of health as far as I can tell. So I consider them to be one of my bigger successes with this aquarium. Another big success has been the canopy and stand. Now, the reason that this aquarium series even got on YouTube was the building of the canopy and stand, and it's done exactly what I wanted. The stand does a great job of helping to really reduce noise that would be coming out of the sump area, as well as the canopy doing the same thing. The canopy also cuts down on light, bleeding out into your, shining into your face when you're in the living room trying to watch TV or whatever else it is. It's never one time been a problem to get into the tank and clean and work and feed the fish, because it is fairly easy for me to, just raise it up and it's out of the way, and I can go up quite a bit further. It's a little hard at this angle, but I can fit a 5-gallon bucket under there and pour water if I want to. And so this canopy has been a major, major success as far as I'm concerned, right there along with the cabinet. Another big success may come as a surprise because I counted it as a failure early on, but it has been the aquarium controller. Although I'm frustrated by the aquarium controller's inability to give me a super important feature of being able to access it by my phone and so on and so on, take that away and still it's been a good investment. The fact that I have these safety nets in place, all of these things that are controlled by the controller, in my opinion, have been indispensable for somebody like me who's not home all day with the aquarium, and I don't always know what my schedule holds. And so having kind of a hired hand here that kind of runs the tank for me in my absence has been a pretty big win. And so I do count the aquarium controller a success, even though I've been pretty frustrated with it. Another big success has been family time. So although when I have buckets everywhere and I have to explain to my wife why it sometimes seems like everything in our house can in some way be used for the aquarium, my children, they really, really like the tank. My wife likes the tank too. But my youngest son in particular is, anytime I start messing with this aquarium at all, he's over here, right here, he wants to know everything I'm doing. He wants to be looking over my shoulder. I periodically catch him opening the doors and peeking in the sump once the lights have come on. He likes to ask me about little things going on down there. And so, although everybody in the family really seems to like the tank, it is my youngest son that seems to enjoy it the most. You could actually hear him in one of my earlier videos asking to help me paint. Have a listen.
Daddy, are you painting again?
Yes, I am painting again.
Daddy, can I? Daddy, can I help you?
Yes, you sure can.
I remember when he said it, it pretty much melted my heart, and there's been a few people on YouTube who have commented that it got them in the feels as well. And he still seems to have this whatever amount of dedication he had back then is minuscule compared to the dedication he has to it now. Because when I start cleaning this tank, he won't stop until I do. So if I could do it all again, what would I do and why? Well, I would go bigger. That's something that you hear over and over and over again in the aquarium circles, is that get the biggest tank you can afford, because you're going to wish you had a bigger tank later on down the road. And I'm no exception to that. One of the things about this aquarium when I built it is I really wanted those hutches on either side. Those are things that I've collected over my lifetime, and I wanted to display them in my home. But even the size that they are now, I think I could have squeezed an extra foot out of this tank. 6 inches that way, 6 inches this way. I also think I could have got another 4 inches this way. Looking at these corals, many of them are beginning to grow together already. A lot of the coral species that I bring home are not that impressive when they're small. It's when they get large that they become a really nice and impressive piece. And I guess I wish I had a little bit more room to let them stretch out and get a little bit bigger. It's not that I would put more corals in there. I would just like for the corals that I have to have a little bit more room to grow. I've been fairly happy with my coral selections. Part of me does wish that there were more acroporas in here. But early on, as I mentioned, I had some difficulty with acroporas, and so I was okay to just stick with the things that I was having good success with. And one of my favorite sections of this aquarium is the little Euphyllia garden that I have here in the middle. My absolute favorite coral in this aquarium, it's kind of a toss-up. It's going to be between this big sponge goad, whatever it is, right here in the center, and this large Trachyphilia brain, Welsophilia brain. It depends on when you bought it, what you might call it. But these two are probably dead even tied for some of my favorite corals. The anemones. I've often been told don't put anemones in your tank. They'll just run around your tank and sting and kill all your corals. I will tell you that I have anemones right up against corals, and although I do see some damage that they are causing, the corals very quickly recover or just simply don't grow in that area. And the anemone seems pretty happy. The corals seem pretty happy. I'm not recommending everybody to do that, but it's worked for me. I probably wouldn't have put the softies, maybe the green star polyps only, maybe the lesser aggressive mushrooms only, but I've had a time with these green hairy mushrooms down here. As a matter of fact, I recently got rid of a bunch. Nobody wants these things. You can't give them away. It kind of hurts my heart and I have to just throw them outside, but there's really not much else I can do. I have this large wavy, I'm not sure what it is up here, whatever, if I figure the name out, I'll put it on the screen. This is the last of a large patch that I had of it as well, and it was beginning to take over the aquarium. I would buy more corals from local fish stores. Even though I just got finished kind of complaining about my local fish store, one of the things that I have observed is when I go on little vacations and trips, there's always a pet store around there. And a lot of them are open on the weekends where I can stop in and on my way out, bag a few things, let them know that I'm going to be on the road, and they're happy to bag them up in such a way that they can survive the trip. I'll bring a little cooler with me just in case. Variety. The pet stores down in North Florida are not ordering from the same suppliers as my pet stores up here in North Alabama. It doesn't appear that way anyway. If they were, I would think they would have all the same stuff. But I walk down there and I see things that I never see in my stores up here. And so if I had it all to go over, I would probably make more of an effort to take little road trips and go visit some other local fish shops and get better selection on my corals. Another thing I would do differently if I had it all to go over, I would stock the aquarium with corals from frag swaps. When I've gone online and I said, hey, I'm looking for, XYZ, does anybody have any? There are tons of reefers who say, yes, I have some and I will bring you some. And they do, and they bring it, and that's been a real good source for me getting corals. They're sending me pictures off of their phones, oftentimes through text message or through the forums, that I can see what the coral looks like before they bring it. But at this point, my aquarium is so full, I don't really have much room for those things. So that's a piece of advice that I would give to somebody who was just starting out, is to really take advantage of your local reef clubs and go to some frag swaps and stock your tank from other local reefers as well. And that's going to wrap up the Ultimate 75-Gallon Aquarium 2-year and 3-day update. I'm going to just go ahead and ask you right now, if you haven't already done so, be sure and give me a subscribe to the channel. Also, be sure and leave a comment down below if there's something that you would like to ask or to just let me know, or maybe something that you've observed about this aquarium. Until next time, this is Jason with Born Handy, and this has been the 2-year, 3-day update to the Ultimate 75-Gallon Aquarium.